Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Twins Talk History podcast.
I'm Isabella.
And I'm Alexandra, and today's episode is on STIs during World War II. A weird topic, but we hope you learned something new. And before we start, we want to say thank you and introduce you to our sponsor. So, this podcast is sponsored by Chic Condoms. You can buy Chic condoms in a small tin in a pack of 3 for just 50 cents. They are made from a strong rubber and have been tested for your protection against venereal diseases. You can find them in any drugstore, and they are a product of the USA. So, a fun fact about these condoms is that the company was founded by a German Jewish immigrant and became one of the best-selling condoms in the United States. These are formed from a latex rubber rather than the previous thicker rubber or animal intestines. These condoms are thinner and hold a shelf life for up to 5 years. They are also much more reliable than the contraceptive sponges, which were only 55 to 95% effective. The use of latex also allows for the condoms to be so much cheaper, and their sales rose after World War II because during World War I, the American Army had many soldiers out of battles because they had venereal diseases. So, the motto is, the American Army benefited greatly from them, so why wouldn't you want to use them too? I want to say thank you again to our sponsor, Chic Condoms. Okay, before we start this, we want to say a little something about why we are actually doing a podcast on STIs during World War II. We are 100% aware of how weird or how out there this topic is, so we just wanted to address it before we get started. Our mom, the school nurse, as you know, teaches the informed decisions-making class at school, and we are inspired by her and our shared passion for health and education to make a podcast on this topic. Spreading information and correct information at that about STIs is very important now, and it was also very important back then. So we wanted to talk about how the information was spread and the basics of the science behind it. I, myself, Alexandra, am very into education and teaching, so when I heard about the hygiene classes during World War I and II, I was very interested in them and how they differ to the different sex ed classes I've taken throughout my life, spanning from 5th grade to now. Okay, so now that we've got that out of the way, let's get started with the information in the podcast. Isabella?
Hi everyone. Now in this portion of the podcast, we are going to cover sexually transmitted infections that greatly impacted the men enlisted in World War II. These sexually transmitted infections are gonorrhea and syphilis. Gonorrhea is a sexually transmitted infection that causes infections in the genitals, rectum, and the throat. This infection will cause a burning feeling and increased discharge, and neither of these are good feelings. During the early 1900s, the military started distributing condoms to troops to try to decrease the amount of men who became infected and would have to be discharged. But during World War I, there were more than 10,000 men who were infected with these venereal diseases and had to be discharged. During World War II, there was a spike of gonorrhea rates, and about 300,000 men were infected with gonorrhea, but they would use penicillin to help relieve their pains. Venereal disease propaganda was made to help stop the spread of infections. These posters mostly looked at prostitutes as the reason for spreading, which had some truth to it. But some posters also looked at the benefits of using condoms and receiving treatments because they would save your life and would help your life at home and your children. The propaganda didn't help decrease the rate of gonorrhea, but there was a rise in the rates in the 1960s and it spiked in 1976. This was because the children who were born in the baby boom were now in their early 20s and hit their sexual maturity. So the venereal diseases these children received from their parents, because gonorrhea can be spread while a woman is pregnant, were now able to be tracked. After 1973, the CDC started to implement a gonorrhea control program, and this allowed for the rate of gonorrhea to have a steady decrease after 1976. Gonorrhea is still a prevalent problem today and is the most common sexually transmitted infection reported in the United States. Syphilis is a sexually transmitted infection that causes genital sores that can damage the heart, brain, and other organs if it does not get treated. In 1999, When World War II started, the rate of venereal diseases was at about 3% for the 200,000 men who were enlisted, but in 1942 the rate went up to about 5% of men in the war had syphilis. After the war, about 2 million men were tested for syphilis, and about 100,000 of them were infected. One of the results of World War II was a cure for syphilis. In 1943, doctors found a way to cure patients suffering from the primary stages of syphilis. This cure benefited the United States during World War II because we had lost a lot of men due to infections. We had to discharge more than 10,000 men due to syphilis. This disease became the fourth disease causing death before World War II, but the death rate for this infection had been decreasing due to treatments that were made and the preventative efforts. During World War I, venereal diseases cost the Army about 18,000 men per day. By the 1940s, during World War II, the number had greatly reduced to 606 men per day. This drop was due to the Army's awareness effort. They tried to raise awareness, but the danger of poor sexual hygiene and because of important medical developments. For example, in 1943, a case needed a 30-day hospital treatment, but by 1944 this was reduced to 5 days and the patient could stay on duty during treatment.
Now let's move our focus to the prevention of STIs. During World War II, there were two main methods to prevent venereal disease. One was condoms. This was referred to as mechanical prophylaxis, with prophylaxis meaning the contraction of venereal disease, and the other was chemical prophylaxis, which was an application of chemicals to the genital area within 2 hours of having sex. This was effective within the military because of the availability and convenience of pro stations within the military, but it was not as effective with civilian use because the prophylactic public health campaign was seen as condoning extramarital sex, and because of the lack of regimentation and supervision in civilian life, which could be accomplished in the military because there was such a large focus on the prevention of the spread of venereal diseases. Most of the material given to and directed at soldiers included a message about prophylaxis. Some said it as taking a pro or taking a visit to a pro station. It wasn't as taboo within the military as it was with civilians. Another way of prevention was propaganda posters. One visual they used was a hospital bed warning soldiers that if they failed to use pro, they would end up there. The tone of these posters was often serious with the message it was trying to display, but some were silly and used characters and animals to show the message. One that I found particularly interesting was a drawing of a room of hospital beds in it, with the main caption being, "The venereal wards are full of wise guys," with the other text around it saying, "I could pick the safe ones, and I refuse prophylaxis." I think this one is really helpful and helps to point out the misconceptions of the soldiers at the time, and at the same time added an element of fear with the hospital beds because they didn't want to end up with the rest of the wise guys. I was originally interested in World War I sex education because of learning about hygiene classes, but since this podcast is about World War II, I wanted to outline some of the differences of the prophylaxis campaigns against STIs during World War I and World War II. The main difference between World War I and World War II was that during World War I, the sex ed material still promoted abstinence, while during World War II, they were more quote-unquote realistic. They assumed that the soldier would most likely engage in that kind of behavior, so the materials reflected that, but they still pushed abstinence despite this. The material gave clear information and included information that outlined how to use prophylaxis and emphasized its importance. They emphasized the importance of taking a pro every time because there was no way to know if any woman was ill or not, and were to assume they were. As recruits entered the military, they were given a pamphlet that gave them information about their sexual health. The most common pamphlet given was called Sex Hygiene and Venereal Disease. It was given to each recruit when they enlisted, and it was ordered by the Secretary of War at the time, G.C. Marshall, and it was prepared under the Surgeon General of the Army. It opens with a quote, "Sex is one of the most important things in your life. for it makes you a man. It's something to be proud of. But like everything else you prize, it must be well cared for. Then the pamphlet moves to normal sex ed things like biology. But it does, like in World War I, urge the soldiers to not have sex before marriage, saying, between people who aren't married, they often lead to shame, sorrow, and disease. And if you wait until you marry, you're safe and keep your self-respect. The main point the pamphlet tries to make is to stay away from easy women, because if a woman lets you, quote, use her easily, then she probably has some kind of venereal disease. And the secondary thing is to use safety measures, aka prophylaxis. But the main principle of the Public Health Service's prophylaxis campaign was to, quote, control venereal disease and to, quote, break the chain of infection.